The gunshot victim arrived at 2:47 a.m., and by the time the elevator doors opened onto the trauma bay, Elena Marsh already knew the man was going to die unless someone made a decision no one else in the room was trained to make. The paramedics were shouting vitals that didn't add up. The resident was fumbling with a chest tube kit like it was his first week. Because it was. And Chief Surgeon Dr. Robert Ashford was 3 minutes out, stuck in traffic on the interstate, screaming instructions through a phone pressed against a nurse's ear. Elena stood at the foot of the bed in scrubs that still smelled like the industrial detergent from the hospital laundry. Her ID badge reading night shift, general surgery, and nobody in that room had any idea that 6 years ago, in a helicopter thundering low over a compound in a country most of them couldn't find on a map, she had done this exact procedure with rotor wash tearing at her hair and tracer fire lighting up the dark outside the open door. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 72%. The resident, a young man named Dr. Priya Anand's colleague, Tom Bellinger, froze with the scalpel hovering an inch from skin that was turning the color of wet ash. "I can't find the landmark," he said, voice cracking. And in another life Elena might have let the silence stretch, might have stayed in her lane the way she'd stayed in her lane for 3 years at Ridgemont General, quiet, competent, invisible. But the man on the table had a collapsed lung filling his chest cavity with blood, and somewhere behind her ribs a version of Elena that she tried to bury under scrub caps and med carts stood up and took the wheel. "Move," she said, and it wasn't a request. She took the scalpel from Bellinger's shaking hand, found the 5th intercostal space by feel alone, made the incision in one clean motion, and had her gloved finger inside the pleural cavity sweeping for adhesions before anyone in the room had processed that the quiet nurse from the 3rd floor had just performed a needle decompression turned open thoracostomy with the calm of someone ordering coffee. The tube went in. The lung reinflated with a wet, beautiful sound. The oxygen monitor climbed. 72, 78, 85, 91. And the room exhaled as one organism while Elena stood there with blood on her wrists, breathing evenly, already reaching for the suction. That was the exact moment Dr. Robert Ashford walked in. Soaked from the rain, tie loosened, and stopped 3 feet inside the doorway as if he'd hit glass. He had built his reputation over 22 years as the best trauma chief in the state. A man who did not believe competence could hide in a nurse's uniform, and what he saw did not compute. A finger thoracostomy performed without ultrasound guidance, without hesitation, with textbook-perfect anatomical precision, by a woman whose personnel file listed her highest qualification as an RN license and 4 years of unspecified overseas medical work. He watched her call out the next 3 steps to Bellinger in a voice that had clearly given orders before, watched her hands move with a muscle memory that civilian nursing school did not produce, and something cold and professional slid into place behind his eyes. "Report to my office. Now," he said, and the words carried down the hallway like a verdict. She followed him past the nurse's station, past Dr. Priya Anand, who caught her eye with a look that was half admiration, half warning, past the vending machines humming in the empty corridor, into an office lined with awards and framed magazine features about the miracle hands of Robert Ashford. He shut the door hard enough to rattle the glass. He didn't sit. He planted both palms on his desk and looked at her the way he looked at a chest x-ray that didn't match the chart. "That was not a nursing procedure," he said. "That was a battlefield thoracostomy. I've seen exactly 2 people perform it that clean in my career, and both of them were combat surgeons I trained alongside during my reserve years. So I am going to ask you once, and I want the truth because right now I have serious doubts about whether your credentials are even real. Who taught you that procedure?" The hospital was silent around them, the kind of silence that exists only at 3 in the morning in a building full of exhausted people. Elena looked at the diplomas on his wall, at the photograph of him shaking hands with a general at some ceremony a decade ago, and she felt the old weight settle onto her shoulders, the weight of a promise she'd made to people who weren't in this room anymore, people whose names were etched on a wall in Arlington that Ashford had probably never had reason to visit. She thought about walking it back, softening it, saying something about a trauma rotation, a mentor, anything that would let this stay small. Instead, she straightened her spine the way she'd been trained to. Years ago, in a hangar at Fort Campbell where the instructors didn't care how tired you were or how much your hands were shaking, only whether the job got done. She met his eyes without blinking. "Task Force 160, she said quietly. Ashford's face didn't move for a full 3 seconds, and in that silence something shifted in the room, something that neither of them could take back. Because Robert Ashford, for all his awards and all his certainty, knew exactly what those 3 words meant. And he knew that if they were true, the quiet nurse standing in front of him had spent years doing things, and surviving things that nobody in this hospital would ever believe. If you felt that chill down your spine, that's the moment the story really begins. And Elena's next words are about to change everything Chief Ashford thought he knew about the people working under his own roof. Hit subscribe now, because Chapter 2 is where the truth finally comes out, and you will not want to miss how this hospital reacts when they learn exactly who they've been underestimating. Ashford lowered himself slowly into his chair, the leather creaking under him, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as if recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman standing across his desk. Task Force 160, he repeated, testing the words like they might dissolve if he said them wrong. The Night Stalkers, the Army's Special Operations Aviation Regiment. He leaned forward. Nurses don't get attached to 160th SOAR, Ms. Marsh. Flight medics do. Combat medics assigned to the most classified rotary wing unit in the U.S. military, the ones who fly special operators into places that don't officially exist on any map. So either you're lying to me right now, or you need to explain to me in detail how a woman with a civilian nursing license ended up performing field thoracostomies out of the back of a Black Hawk. Elena exhaled slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, she let the wall down. I wasn't always a nurse first, she said. I enlisted at 19. Went through the pipeline 68W, then flight medic school at Fort Rucker, then years of trying to prove to men twice my size that I could keep pace with an assault force in full kit while carrying an aid bag heavier than most of them wanted to admit. I was cleared for 160th after 2 combat tours, because they needed someone who could keep a soldier alive during an 11-minute flight over hostile terrain with no backup, no second opinion, and no time to hesitate. We didn't have surgeons on those birds, Dr. Ashford. We had me, a med bag, and whatever training I could remember with rounds cracking against the fuselage. She paused. The procedure I did tonight, I've done it 11 times in the field. Once with the aircraft taking fire. That's not something you learn in nursing school. That's something you learn because if you don't do it right, someone's son doesn't come home. Ashford sat back, and the arrogance that had defined every interaction Elena had ever had with him seemed to drain slowly out of his shoulders, replaced by something closer to reckoning. Why didn't you tell anyone? He asked, quieter now. 3 years, Elena. 3 years you've been on my floor, and I treated you like... He stopped himself, unwilling to finish the sentence, but they both knew how it ended, like someone beneath his attention. Like someone whose competence was a surprise instead of a certainty. Because when you come home from that world, she said, people either treat you like a hero they don't understand, or a liability they're afraid of. I didn't want either. I wanted to heal people quietly, without the questions, without men like you deciding what I was capable of before you'd even bothered to ask. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in years. Tonight I made a choice because a man was dying and your resident didn't have the hands yet. I'd make the same choice again. Word moved through Ridgemont General the way it always does in hospitals. Not through announcements, but through the particular electricity of nurses trading glances at the station, of Dr. Priya Anand quietly telling the ICU team what she'd witnessed, of Tom Bellinger, still shaken, describing to anyone who'd listen how the quiet night nurse had saved his patient's life with hands that never once hesitated. By morning shift change, half the hospital had heard some version of the story, each retelling adding a little more myth to what had genuinely happened, until Elena Marsh walked into the cafeteria and the room went quiet in a way that wasn't fear anymore. It was respect, the kind that arrives late but arrives completely. 3 days later, a black government sedan pulled into the hospital's front circle, and a 2-star general stepped out in dress uniform, flanked by an aide carrying a small case. Ashford watched from his office window as the general walked directly to the ICU, asked for Sergeant First Class Elena Marsh by her old rank, and when she appeared in the doorway in her scrubs, he did something that stopped every conversation on that floor cold. He saluted her, a full, formal salute, held for 3 full seconds, in front of nurses, doctors, and patients' families who had no idea what they were witnessing. Only that whoever this woman was, She had earned something most people never would. Ashford stood in the hallway and watched his floor nurse, the one he'd nearly reported to HR for insubordination, the one whose credentials he'd questioned in front of his own resident, receive a commendation for actions during a classified 2019 extraction that the general could only vaguely allude to, actions that had kept 2 operators alive long enough to make it home to their families. When the ceremony ended and the sedan pulled away, Ashford found Elena at the nurse's station and, for the first time in 22 years of running that trauma floor, he said 4 words he'd never said to anyone under his supervision. "I was wrong, Sergeant." She just nodded, tired in the particular way of someone who has spent her whole life being underestimated and overworked, and went back to charting. Because that's what quiet heroes do. They don't wait for the salute. They don't need the applause. They just keep showing up for the next patient, the next crisis, the next 3 in the morning when someone's life depends on hands that have never once forgotten how to save it. If this story moved you, if you felt that goosebump moment when the general saluted her, that's exactly why this channel exists. To tell the stories of the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people carrying entire hidden lives behind ordinary uniforms. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because next week we're bringing you another hidden hero whose past is about to collide with a present that has no idea who they're really dealing with. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.